Well, welcome back for another short lesson on IB psychology, abnormal psychology, learning outcome 5.3, and we're talking about discussing cultural and ethical considerations in diagnosis. As a quick little review from the last time we were together, we were talking about 5.2, discussing the validity and reliability of diagnosis, and there we go, 5.2. And so when we looked at diagnosis, we were looking at a standardization of what is considered to be either normal or abnormal. We also talked about the reliability of diagnosis, and the Cooper study, that was the US UK Diagnostic Project study, kind of gave us better insight into how reliable making diagnosis can or cannot be. And the third point, the validity of diagnosis, we looked at I don't know if I mentioned it or not, the Mitchell study, which was a meta-analysis. It's not a great study to look at, but they were looking at the validity of diagnosis it refers to receiving the correct diagnosis, and as a result of that, the correct treatment. And if the person ends up getting better or receives a little bit better stasis, then we find ourselves probably saying that this person has achieved a correct diagnosis and the validity of the diagnosis is correct. Well, all these play in hand when we talk about how culture and ethnical considerations play into making a diagnosis. And 5.3, again, is a level 3 question, and it can be rather it can be rather complex and considering it. But what I do is I rely here on the fact that you guys had really actually been very good about picking out these differences when we went through the various levels, the biological versus the cognitive versus the social cultural. So let's go ahead and move on to the next here. And here we're talking about cultural considerations in diagnosis. And what we have to look at here in this particular study is the Ballinger study, 2001. And in this culture, I've written here for you, culture does not necessarily reflect social or medical reality. And that was the gist of the Ballinger study itself. It's in your study guide. There may be unknown factors that influence diagnosis. For example, different methods of clinical assessment, differences in classification, a lack of cultural appropriate instruments, such as standardized clinical reviews, or interviews, I should say, or problems in relations or to translation to the clinical interviews. And those of you that speak not just English, but other languages and have been exposed to other languages, you know that in some cases there are not words that have a direct translation to English, or English doesn't have a translation directly to another foreign language. And this has a tendency to be the same in healthcare, both mental health care and regular health care. And so culture may influence psychiatric diagnosis in several ways. So this is the Ballinger study itself. The different cultural groups have different attitudes to psychological disorder. This is really important for us to consider here. Crazy is a broader definition. Crazy is not necessarily crazy in one particular culture, but may certainly be way over the top in our culture. So when we consider these things, we have to consider what does the culture actually consider to be abnormal. The second thing is there's a cultural bias in diagnosis. For example, the clinician does not observe certain symptoms because he or she is not familiar with the expression of distress in a particular culture. And I'm trying to think at the back of my mind. Certain Asian cultures do not outwardly display their emotional ness, if you will. Allow me to use that word, make that a new word. Saving face of the Japanese culture, this idea that we don't display our emotion outwardly because it is a reflection poorly taken in the Japanese culture. So one hides their face. their emotional phase from others. And the third thing is the cultural bounce syndromes, disorders that are specific to a particular culture, could be difficult to recognize for clinicians, and this could prevent people from being treated. There are a few little odd disorders out there that have kind of emerged on the scene that are only cultural specific, and off the top of my head, I don't have any of those that are specific to this particular short lesson. Probably if I prepared for this lesson in broader detail, I probably would have been able to come up with a few odd ones. But anyway, let's go on. The next thing to consider here is the idea of emic and etic considerations. And we talked about etic and emic way back in 4.12 in the social cultural aspects, but just as a quick review, emic is, well, both etic and emic are both anthropological terms, but they do have application in psychology because we do consider the idea of social cultural levels of analysis to be fundamental to our understanding of human behavior. So let's go back to emic. That's just a quick review. They are linguistic terms, and emic is, put quotation marks around it, it's the inside looking out. It's research studies of one culture alone to understand culture-specific behaviors. The African culture that looked at, because a gate or a barn door fell down, they looked at the building as being possessed by spirits. And in order for that to be able to be addressed, they had to address the spirit and habitation of that barn. And once that was done, then it would, they could move on. But if a barn door were to fall down, let's say in our horse barn, we would look at it and say, oh, the wood's rotten, the hardware's gone, or somebody booby-trapped it, wildly speaking. And there would be a brief probably mechanical explanation as to what's going on. So these are two different cultures approaching two different things. And remember with emic, the Bartlett 32 study was really good at explaining this, and that's the Swazi-Hertzman study. So it's an intrinsic kind of an idea, emic, inside looking out. The etic itself is the extrinsic value, the outside looking in, and etic research compares psychological phenomena across cultures to find out what could be universal in human behavior. So it's looking at a bigger picture. Etic is looking at a bigger picture and trying to figure out what in fact is a connection between what is common between all cultures. Okay, so what we're looking at here in this particular bullet is how central, okay, are some symptoms in diagnosis, and here how universal are some other diagnoses. And your companion guide, your course review guide, talks about the universalist approach, the etic approach in diagnosis, which emphasizes the cross-cultural relevance or equivalences of diagnostic concepts to underlying processes. Symptoms and disorders are manifested through universal underlying processes. That's a good way to look at it. The relativist, okay, hard word for me to say, or the emic approach to diagnosis emphasizes the fundamental role of culture in psychopathology. The culture shapes symptoms and how people experience distress, as well as beliefs about causes and consequences of such problems. Now here, in the second bullet under etic and emic in diagnosis, if you only know one Western or North American culture, your mainstream American culture, then you don't put a lot of validity in the second bullet that I've just talked about. But those of you that are strongly influenced or are strongly influenced by your own subcultures, there is a great deal here that is very, very valid. And you know better than I, and I, to a lesser degree, do know this as well, that our culture plays a huge role in what and who we are and how we approach problems in life. Our human behavior is greatly influenced by what we are, and what we are is our culture. Our culture influences who we are. And those of you that I'm addressing this particular statement to, you know who you are, okay? And you could probably nod your head in the affirmation saying, yes, I understand this. This is true. We could probably go off on a tangent talking about individual levels of understanding with our culture. It helps us dictate our approaches to problem solving, behaviors, and things of this nature. So it's very, very true. The studies that help support this, there are two here. The Kermeyer study of 2001 and I think it's Buhai study of 99 help us understand this a little bit better. So moving on. The next one is the misdiagnosis due to cultural differences in expression of symptoms. And this probably comes as a result of I think it's the EDIC approach, when we try to apply universal or universalities to a particular problem, and we miss it altogether because of cultural differences. And the three studies that I put here, the Jacob study, the Bugara study, and the Zhang study, are pretty good studies as far as helping us better understand how this occurs. In the Jacob study, was a sample of Indian women in a general practice in London. The doctors were not likely to detect depression if the women did not disclose their symptoms. The same can be found in research with cultural minorities in the U.S. and Australia. The Jacob study really does help us to best understand this. A lot of cultures aren't going to talk about their symptoms. If they're considered to be universal among a group of people, such as genders, that's really, they think it's their lot in life and go on from there. I'll let you look through the other studies on your guidebook to take a look at how these compare. There is an interesting case study at the bottom by Zhang, the 98 study, and Zhang and Su, and I'm mispronouncing it. I am so sorry if I offended anybody here. Culture and Depression in China. This is the one I probably have referred to several times during the course of the year, in which if you were to look at a World Health Organization statistical reporting, monthly reporting, and these things are collected monthly. Same with the folks at the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia. They collect this data reported out monthly, and then they report it out to the world as a whole. It would say that while most of the world suffers a fair amount of depression across the board, or diagnosis of depression, new cases and continuing cases of depression, in China you're going to see a significant drop in the number of new cases reported and or the number of cases that are actually being worked through. And that is simply right here in this particular case study that was examined by these two psychologists, in which they found that the reason that China had a lower than normal reporting of diagnosis of depression was simply because it's not that it didn't exist in China. It does. It just, the symptomology, the way it was perceived, was different. And so as a result of it being different, it wasn't reported out as the same disorder. And so here's a clear, in my opinion, only my opinion, and probably others' opinion, because it wouldn't have been reported here in your study guide, is a good example of how we can misdiagnose due to cultural difference in expression of symptoms. It's a very good example. It's the Zhang study. Let's move on. When we are looking at these things, the final thing to consider is the ethical considerations in diagnosis. And here we have to go back to the Rosenhan, study. What we need to, before we go back to the Rosenhan study, is when we're talking about ethical considerations of diagnosis, this is, are we really, in fact, making a correct diagnosis and treatment. This goes back to the 5.2 study that we had looked at, the last study we were involved in. Yeah, 5.2. Correct diagnosis and treatment when we are treating a person. Do we have any biases here? It's the second bullet, biases in diagnosis. There may be various biases in the diagnosis process, i.e. gender bias, ethical biases, age biases. You know, as I've gotten older, I've discovered that not readily, not readily towards me, but I have noticed this among other people, and I've probably been guilty of it myself, is that we have a tendency to show age bias. Even you, in your age group, show age bias towards people of my age group. You look at us as being, not all of you, but you look at us as being older, less capable. Here, let me lift that for you, old man, old woman. Are you kidding? You can't do that. You shouldn't be looking for love. You're too old for that. You see it more and more. You hear it more and more. It's when you pay attention to it, it's when you're on the receiving end of it. And I guess since my retirement, I guess it's more and more of an issue that I'm seeing appearing around people around my age. Well, Rosenhan looks at the stigmatization of this type of consideration and diagnosis. And he claimed that psychiatric diagnosis carried a personal, legal, and social stigma. He demonstrated that diagnosis is a serious mental illness, okay, such as schizophrenia, could be based on limited information. And he also argued that a psychiatric diagnosis is often associated with significant consequences in terms of being considered a deviant or social stigma that is attached to it. And especially with, let's go back to schizophrenia, especially with schizophrenia, because as I've told you time and time again, it is one of those mental disorders that really has a tendency to bring a lot of social stigma with it in our Western culture. I don't know how it's perceived in other cultures, but in our culture, it's considered to be quite fearful. And so as a result of it, you sometimes become your diagnosis. You shouldn't, but know somebody, become familiar with somebody that is diagnosed with something like schizophrenia. And remember, the population occurrence is about 1 in 400, 500, so plus or minus people that this comes about in. And you're coming up to the age where we start seeing the pre-symptoms manifesting themselves in a given population. And so it only gets worse as you get a little bit older. And so as a result of that, this loss of reality becomes, even though it's controlled, a lot of people have certain stigmas with them. And one of the stigmas is violence. That people with schizophrenia are rather violent people. And they can be violent. Don't get me wrong here. They can be violent. But they're not usually violent openly to others. They're not serial killers. They're not actively murderers. Okay? They harm mostly themselves. But this still does not allow that stigmatization to move away from them. Okay? In the next study, the Jenkins, Hall, and Sacco study of 91, they looked at ethical bias in the diagnosis process. And researchers presented videotapes of a person in therapy to a number of European American males and female therapists. And the video presented different situations. The patient was male or female, black or white, with depressed symptoms or non-depressed symptoms. And the results showed that white therapists were more likely to make a false positive diagnosis if the patient was black. For example, a black patient would be diagnosed with depression even though in the absence of depression symptoms. Sometimes odd behavior, when we look at ethical groups, blacks, Hispanics, and so on and so forth, we have a tendency to automatically say to ourselves, mentally disabled, okay, versus quirky behavior, all right? And then the Boverman, hold on, I think, wait a minute. Yeah, here we go. Next, sorry to shout. The Boverman et al. Study of 1970 looked at gender biases in diagnosis. And much like the ethical considerations, gender biases argued that many psychiatrists are males, and that's still very true, remember, whose perspective is situated with normative gender roles and a patriarchal culture. For example, if a woman is unhappy about her role as a housewife and a mother because she is stressed and bored, a male psychiatrist would diagnose her with depression. This would be an example of overdiagnosis. Let's take another example here. Often, women are viewed as having a specific role, that you're going to go through school, graduate, maybe go on to college, find a husband, okay, marry, then start working on a family. And we find those women that say, I never really had a desire to marry. I never had a desire to have children. No. Then we look at those women as being different. They stand out. Okay? A man comes along and says, nah, I didn't want to marry. We say he's just playing the field. Or other words like it. If a man says, no, I don't want to have children, I never really wanted to have children, we really don't place him in a different category. We don't really look at them as being unusual or odd. Maybe his mother does, but not necessarily him. Okay? So we do have a gender bias. Okay? So let me go ahead and wrap this up on the next slide here. So let's make our closing remarks here. We talked about culture. That's supposed to be an R there. So culture as a process of diagnosis. And I'm just going to use the abbreviation for diagnosis, and that's a DX. You're welcome to use the same small annotation. So when it comes to culture and diagnosis, we know that we have to consider several things. We know we have to consider, are we looking at from the inside out? That's emic, okay? Or are we looking at from the a universal kind of an outside in? That's etic. All right. We looked at a couple studies. We looked at misdiagnosis, and then I put the DX here, misdiagnosis, okay, because of cultural differences and in expression of symptoms, okay, how we express our symptoms. Maladies are expressed a little differently. If I were to ask several of you, you would come up to me and say, I'm hurting. I would say, point to where you're hurting. You would probably take, most of you, the fingers of your hand and swipe over the entire region instead of taking one index finger and pointing, saying it comes from here in my knee and moves to here on my kneecap. All right, as an example that would be really fitting for what I would need to know. Then we looked at ethical considerations. So we looked at ethical considerations, and we found out that stigmas do exist, the Rosenhan study of 75. Then we looked at biases that we can bring into diagnoses, okay? So we had biases in ethical considerations, and then we had the gender bias. And how we look at the various, the two sexes, male and female. This particular learning outcome discussed cultural and ethical considerations. Again, this is a level 3 question because of the command prompt here, the word discuss. And I probably would say this would be a real good one to put on the May exam. I cannot remember the last time this appeared on an exam itself or words of that nature. But remember now, on the second day of exams, you were taking just one essay, sitting down for an hour plus and writing one essay. So you've got to write a 5 to 7 paragraph essay in 1 hour. All right. You're supposed to be getting some clues on how to approach your exams. If you don't, just let me know. I certainly got short little lectures on how to approach your exams to help you prepare for that exam. It's not that difficult if you are talking to one another and evaluating each other's writings. You should be able to approach your exam and do very, very well on them. I had faith in you all the way up to the time I left, that you were capable of bringing great pride to yourself, to your class, and well, you've always made me proud. But to be able to do this, it's just a matter of calming yourself before you take an exam, and that goes for any type of major exam, whether it be your IB exams, all of them, or whether it be an AP exam, or whether it be your SATs. It's just a matter of calming yourself because the information is there. You just have to be able to access that information someplace in your memory. All right. Well, signing off for now. Okay, and then we'll come back with the next time we get together, or I get together with you. We'll be talking about 5.4, describing symptoms and prevalence of two disorders, and we'll talk about eating disorder and an affective disorder, which is major depression. Okay. Bye bye.